In this decade, FPS games have been dominated by the modern military shooter. Games like Call of Duty and Battlefield have set the tempo for the genre, and that tempo was slow and deliberate. But one series had to look back in order to push the genre forward. By the midpoint of this decade, mainstream first-person shooters were starting to become stale. Call of Duty's modern military bombast had become blunted by yearly installments. By 2016, they had decided to go to space. And the Battlefield series had released Hardline to a muted response. A change was needed to rekindle what players loved about the genre and to find new fans who may have been put off by the copy and paste design of these games. It should be noted that there were some developers trying to harken back to the freewheeling style of game that had been the genre's origin. Strafe, developed by Pixel Titans, had started its Kickstarter in 2015 and took direct inspiration from 90s arena shooters. Bulletstorm, made by People Can Fly, the developers of Painkiller, introduced skill shots to its colourful and irreverent FPS adventure. Even in 2016, Titanfall 2 and Devil Daggers had, in their own differing way, tried to give players more freedom in movement than most shooters of the era. But most of these games, while critically lauded, did not set the charts on fire. It took the granddaddy of the genre to take it from the brown trudge of the modern military shooter and into the light. A new entry into the Doom franchise was announced all the way back in 2007, with developers id Software aiming to make the game a reimagining of Doom 2. This version of the game would have tasked the player with defending an Earth that had been invaded by Hell's demons, joining up with resistance fighters to battle in demolished streets. In this form, the game would have placed an emphasis on cinematic set pieces and vehicle sections, with less of the horror elements that had been at the core of the Doom 3 experience. Thankfully, this version of the game, which had been internally nicknamed Call of Doom, was scrapped in 2011, and the developers started from scratch. The team at id wanted to strip the game back to basics and ignore whatever current trends had bogged down the cancelled version of Doom 4. It went through several different iterations before they revealed the newest game in the series, now simply titled Doom. That uncomplicated title is apt, as the game itself did away with the most superfluous elements that distracted from the core gameplay loop. And it was this loop that was to be one of the most effective of the decade. What sets Doom 2016 apart from the rest of the genre at that time, and many games since, is its insistence on player movement. To put it simply, if you don't keep moving in this game, you will die. Most shooters at the time had the player stuck to cover and mowing down mindless grunts who run towards the player. Hiding behind crates and popping out for the occasional headshot does not fit the Doomslayer's MO. So id forces the player to keep moving, often in ingenious ways. The speed of the game obviously ties into this. If you stand still, you will quickly be overwhelmed. But the enemy design also forces you to rethink how you play. Some, like the Imp, will charge at the player and quickly close ground. But others, such as the Revenant, will hold their ground for much longer. Having the player juggle melee and ranged attacks compels them to strafe, jump, and run around the arenas instead of planting themselves in a corner. The lack of regenerating health was another change to the usual FPS formula, Again, a throwback to the early days of the genre. Health packs and armor pickups are scattered around the levels. And this ties into the glory kills mechanic. After you deal enough damage to an enemy, they enter a staggered phase, in which you can melee attack them to gain an additional health pickup. Likewise, you can use the chainsaw to gain more ammo from enemies, and score a lusciously gory kill to boot. All this encourages the player to get more aggressive when low on health, as opposed to ducking behind cover while they wait for the screen to become less red. The constant motion of firefights is initially overwhelming, especially if you're used to the genre conventions at the time. But you learn to adapt, and soon you'll start to relish the challenge. This is the designer's intention, to make the player feel like the Doomslayer, constantly looking for combat and bringing the fight to the demons. This was aided by other elements of the game, starting with the story. From the moment that the Doomslayer tosses away a screen that is delivering exposition to the player at the start of the game, it's clear that Doom takes a very different approach to its storytelling. Instead of the usual intrusive cutscenes or drawn-out audio logs, this is a game that lets the gameplay do the talking. There is a story and plenty of background lore in the form of the Codex, but none of it gets in the player's way, and only serves as the merest hint of context for the shoot-'em-up carnage. And most of the story has a very tongue-in-cheek attitude, gently poking at corporate greed and the ridiculous nature of the Doom mythos itself. This self-referential approach never feels overdone, and is balanced enough that you don't feel like you're playing a parody. Instead, you just feel like the Doomslayer. This feeling is aided by one of the most celebrated original soundtracks for a game this decade. Mick Gordon's peerless soundtrack not only celebrates the MIDI metal roots of the series' music, but also updates it in thrilling fashion. Ironically, the soundtrack initially had much less emphasis on heavy distorted guitars and double kick drums. However, the developers and musicians felt that a more synth-focused score wouldn't tie into the action quite as well. Indeed, the thrash metal stylings of the music is the perfect accompaniment to the aggressive push-forward combat of the game, and as it is now, it's hard to imagine anything else in its place. While the soundtrack has been rightly acclaimed for its bombast and zeal, it also has moody and atmospheric moments that ramp up expertly into heavy crescendos. The real secret to the soundtrack's success is that it knows when to get heavy, when to pull back, and exactly how long to ramp up. The composition of this music mirrors the gameplay loop of a typical level, and like all great video game soundtracks, underscores and reinforces whatever experience the player is having with the game. While other games try to tell you are a badass, in Doom you actually feel it, and a major factor in that was the score. Upon its release, Doom was met with critical and commercial success. A sequel, Doom Eternal, is slated for release in March 2020, and it looks to be bringing to life the Hell on Earth concept of the abandoned Doom 4 id was previously developing. But what influence has Doom 2016 had on the genre? For one thing, it was part of a wave of games that offered a faster FPS gameplay experience, with more movement options and verticality to levels. This can be seen in modern Call of Duty games, such as Black Ops 4, and even in Battle Royale games, like Fortnite and Apex Legends. While none of these games offer quite the same non-stop action that Doom does, they are still a million miles away from the stiff and slow shooter campaigns from the start of the decade. It also confirmed that fans were eager to revisit the gameplay styles and aesthetic of the 90s. 2018 saw the release of Dusk, while the popular Doom clone Blood was remastered and released in 2019. But, for the most part, not many games have followed Doom's example or success. We have had other great franchise reboots, but none that have recaptured the spirit of what made the series shine in quite the same way. In that respect, Doom is unique. Instead of rebooting a franchise to fit in with whatever the current trend is in gaming, it ignored convention and chose a path that was, and still is, less travelled. High-octane firefights, a self-aware narrative, and a weighty soundtrack combined to give us one of the most unique shooters in years. Hey guys, we'll be back soon with the next entry in our countdown. We also have a new podcast series starting soon. One of the first ones we recorded was actually to do with our games of the decade and sort of each of us arguing our case for what we think should make the list, so watch out for that coming soon. In the meantime, please subscribe if you would like us to make more videos like this, and thanks for watching.